I'm going to try and focus the talk on a bit about, what is possible when people create the environment to be able to imagine an alternative society. And, I think the idea and the spirit, or perhaps philosophy, of the Rojava Revolution. And I think it's not possible to meaningfully understand the Rojava Revolution without understanding that it does have quite a deep history. It didn't happen overnight. No real transformation of a society does ever really happen overnight. And especially in the case of the Rojava Revolution, which is, is now officially called the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria. But just for the sake of making it easier for myself when I'm talking, I'm going to call it Rojava. But that is not the official name of it anymore. And the reason behind that is Rojava literally means west in Kurdish. And the more the revolution expanded and therefore encompassed, more diverse groups of people, that's when the people decided that for it to be more inclusive, the name of the area shouldn't be a Kurdish name, and it should be something that's more inclusive, which is why we have yet another acronym. So the history of the Kurdish people is essentially the starting point of this revolution, in a way that the Kurdish people have existed and lived in those lands for many, many centuries, if not thousands of years. And especially in the last 100 years, after the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the drawing of the borders of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, the Kurdish people were divided into 4 nation states. So that was Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And so therefore, within these nation states, the Kurdish people experienced many forms of oppression, suppression. Particular forms of assimilation policies were imposed on them, and not to mention the many massacres and the genocide attempts against the Kurdish people in all 4 nation states that they had been divided into. Within Turkey, there was an official assimilation policy called the Turkification process, where the then leaders and the presidents of the Turkish Republic said there's no such thing as Kurds, they're just mountain Turks, which means anyone who claims to be Kurdish is a threat and a risk to Turkishness, so they deserve to die. And similar policies in Iraq and Syria, with the process of something called the Arab Belt. So there was, again, an Arabization policy to Arabize the Kurdish populations of those areas, were imposed on the millions of Kurdish people that lived there. And yet, that's important to recognize, actually, that in that region, there's 35 to 40 million Kurdish people. So they're hardly a minority, really. And so there was, within Syria, which is what will be the focus of this session, as a result of the Arabization process and the Arab Belt, there were again, the Kurdish language was banned, Kurdish culture, any sort of expression of Kurdish existence, really. And also, I think, and again, I might be wrong about the year, but I think it was at some point in the 60s that a lot of Kurdish people were stripped of their citizenship in Syria. So which meant it was very difficult for them to leave the country. They couldn't buy property. It was very difficult for them to even buy a car. So, it meant that they were, the attempt was to somehow make them more or less completely and utterly reliant on the Syrian Arab Republic. And so, fast forward a little bit, there was, so as many people know, there was the Arab Spring in 2011, where there were many uprisings in the region. And so in 2012, at the time when there were uprisings in other parts of Syria, the Syrian president, Assad, must have thought that he needed his troops more in the south of the country, so he literally withdrew them from the north. So the Kurdish freedom movement that had been preparing for something like this for many years, for for about 40 years, saw this as, a vacuum to be able to put into practice the paradigm they had been putting together for a very long time, which then at this time, the autonomy was declared in northern Syria in 2012, and therefore the revolution as it's progressing today was put into practice, which meant that there were communes, the very ground level of society, the communes to the neighborhood assemblies, to the cantons, and then obviously now to the federation level assemblies. They started to build those. And while they were doing this, there was autonomous women structures that were being built, and each what we call general structure, which would be, the general communes, had a 40% quota for women, and there had to be a co-chair system, so one man and one woman who would administrate that level of society, and therefore the most important decisions for society are made at the very ground level. Now, this paradigm, and this has roots not just within Syria, but also, in the foundations of the Kurdish freedom movement that were founded within the current borders of Turkey as well. And I don't know if many people have heard about Abdullah Ocalan, who is essentially the thinker behind this revolution. It was his ideas that inspired and motivated these people not only to believe that they could transform their own society, but also, once the threat of ISIS came, that they could also fight against ISIS in the name of direct democracy, ecology, and gender equality. And so the foundations of this movement, and the reason why I emphasize this is, sometimes we forget that, some things are not possible overnight when we're trying to make change wherever we are in the world. And I can't imagine anyone disagreeing that, obviously we don't live in a perfect world. So there's a long way for us to go everywhere we are. And so these struggles, and especially the foundations of the Rojava revolution, would not have been possible it would not have been possible if there weren't those foundations built. So, Abdullah Ocalan, not only was he the thinker behind this paradigm, but also spent 15 years in Syria talking to the communities and the society every day and trying to understand them. So that is potentially one of the biggest differences between what's happening in northern Syria right now and many other revolutionary instances that in history, is that it's not a vanguardist movement or a revolution that says, okay, we're here now and this is the way we want you to live. It's built in a way that it's completely embedded within its community and within its society, and therefore that's why the most ground level of society, the communes, are the where all the decisions for society get made. And so when I was there in April, I just want to speak a little bit about our trip and kind of go through the timeline, because each stop I feel like there's anecdotes that really display the spirit of what's happening there. So we arrived there. The purpose of the trip was mainly to do research on the alternative education system of Rojava and the alternative economy, so the cooperative economy that is being put into practice there. And so we first arrived so you land in Iraq and you cross over the border, and the first place you arrive in is what they call the Jazeera canton. And so that's the very east of, I guess, northern Syria, so the north east. And so that was one of the first places that this system was put into practice, and at the moment it's kind of the de facto capital. And this is where a lot of the women's assemblies exist, the youth assemblies, and also where they have something called the Internationalist Commune of Rojava, which is where a lot of internationalists go, and and have the opportunity to take part in 6-week or 6-month education sessions, which then they can come back to, go back to their respective countries or respective movements and, organize with that experience. And so we spent some time there, and it was remarkable how, it's the Middle East. It's most where we were, it was mostly Kurdish people, but also a lot of Arab people that we met as well. And some of the questions before I went that people asked were, the conflicts between Arabs and Kurds, because unfortunately the region has been plagued with sectarian conflicts for way too long. And I kind of expected to see that a little bit myself, and I kind of questioned myself after when I realized that that weren't the case as to why I thought to expect that.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.